Hi everyone, it's Nicole here, and today we'll be talking about psychoanalytic theory. So to start it off, I wanted to talk about the primary founder of the theory, Sigmund Freud, and his life. So he was born in 1856 into a large family of 8 children that had a Jewish faith. And he was raised in a really crowded apartment in Vienna. And his father was a merchant who was considered very strict and traditional in the way he raised children. And Freud completed a medical degree, and he then went and worked at the Vienna General Hospital, where he treated hysteria primarily through hypnosis. Then later on, he obviously ultimately developed a theory of personality and the first readily agreed upon theory of counseling, psychoanalysis. He married when he was 29 to Martha, and he opened up a private practice where he worked with patients. And he had 6 children together with Martha, and he recognized that humans have an unconscious which motivates their behaviors. He particularly felt that humans' unconscious sexual and aggressive impulses influence their behaviors. And he thought that after he did the psychoanalysis on himself, and he analyzed himself for a while in his early 40s, and then he decided that he actually had some hostility towards his father, who, remember, was quite strict, and he loved his mother, who was attractive. And by the age of 44, he published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which looked at unconscious desires and experiences. While Freud was raised in the Jewish faith, in his adult life, he was non-practicing. And eventually he published a book, The Ego and the Id, and moved to London with Martha and his daughter Anna. And he did that because the Nazis publicly burned a number of his books, so that's why he moved. And when he was 67, he was diagnosed with jaw cancer and had more than 30 operations until he died in 1939 at the age of 83. So when we talk about Freud, it's important to talk about the ego states. That's one of the most important aspects. So there are 3 ego states, or structure of personality. And the first is the id, and this one's developed. It's the first to develop. It happens in infancy when children are needing to meet all of their basic needs. So it's all about the pleasure principle. Me. What do I need? So then to later on, as a person develops, according to Freud, they develop their ego, which could be considered like the traffic cop. And this is ruled more by the reality principle. So if we think about the ego has no real idea or concept of what right and wrong is, but rather it's just simply trying to achieve all of the desires of the id, but in a way that won't hurt itself in the future. So the ego is like, okay, you can have that piece of chocolate cake, but let's wait until after dinner. That would be an example. And then the superego would be the judge, or considered the moral principle. So, and it's more of about what society needs. That's more of its goals and worries. So one way I've heard this described is the id could be described as like the devil sitting on your shoulder telling you all these negative things to do that'll hurt you if you do them. And then the ego could be considered like the person trying to make the decision about what to do. And the superego is like the angel sitting on the other shoulder saying, really, you shouldn't do what the id is saying, because that's really negative for society. So also Freud felt like there was the unconscious and conscious. And you've probably seen the picture of the iceberg, and while we can see some ice at the top, we can't see all of the ice that stems all the way down at the bottom. So all of that ice down at the bottom would be considered the unconscious. And the unconscious is what lies deep below the surface, and it includes drives and instincts. And the conscious is what's up above the surface that we can see and are aware of, and it's considered logic or reality. But because we have these different unconscious and conscious and ego states that are constantly in conflict, then we are likely to experience some anxiety, which may manifest itself in the form of defense mechanisms. So some defense mechanisms that you probably are aware of are repression. So just completely like acting like it didn't happen, trying to avoid it, denying it, and then denial. Projection, which would be putting on your wants onto other people. And then sublimation is another example. There are a lot more, but I just wanted to say a few that you probably had heard of. So some ways to access the unconscious would include interpretation of dreams, slips of the tongue, hypnosis, and free associations. So one of those examples of free association is that Rorschach assessment or the ink blot assessment, where you look at the ink blot and then you're supposed to say what that looks like to you. Or free association could be associating different words with the first word that comes to your mind when that word's spoken. So then there's also the development of the personality, which would include several stages. So the stages would include the oral stage, which happens in infancy during the first year of life when children want to stick everything in their mouth. The anal stage, which is when they're learning to get potty trained from ages 1 to 3. The phallic stage from ages 3 to 6. The latency stage, where those desires tend to lie dormant and social interests tend to be explored more. And then the genital stage from ages 12 on. So when we think about those stages, Freud believed that we could get stuck in some of those stages, and then whatever we got stuck in, then that would manifest itself in issues later on in life. So for somebody who's stuck in the oral stage, they might smoke all the time, like Freud did, or they might have an eating disorder because they're constantly thinking about that. For somebody who's stuck in the anal stage, they might be considered really rigid and anal retentive and trying to get everything done in a really strict, structured way. So those are just some examples. Then other theorists who would fall under this psychoanalytic approach to counseling would be Erik Erikson and Carl Jung. And Erik Erikson came up with the stages, very similar to Freud's stages, but these are psychosocial stages. And he believed, and they continued on later in life, and he believed that there were different milestones in our development that we had to reach in order to resolve these, our issues that we had. So in identity development and intimacy versus isolation and generativity would all be considered a part of that. So there's like 8 stages, and I'm sure you've heard about them before, and we'll hear about them more in your human development course. Then therapy with psychoanalytic therapists traditionally would involve lying on a couch and not looking at the therapist at all. So totally turned away from the therapist, and the therapist might be several feet away behind a desk writing notes, and that would be to promote this kind of blank screen approach so that the client could put all of any kind of issue they had on the therapist, and the therapist could recognize any transference that may be occurring. And the goal of this is to make the unconscious conscious, and it's to strengthen the ego and the ego states that are needed to be strengthened. So it's believed to be a slow and gradual process that only can occur over many years of therapy, happening multiple times a week, typically for multiple hours at a time. So now, though, there are briefer psychodynamic approaches that rely on many of these same principles, but are considered a little bit less costly and time-consuming. Then there is transference that I wanted to define for you. I mentioned it earlier, but transference is where the client projects onto the counselor feelings that they maybe had when they were a child. So they might feel like the counselor is really strict and overbearing, and they might rebel in some way. And that would be kind of a representation of how their childhood went and how they feel now. And then countertransference is when the therapist transfers their feelings onto the client. So, and that actually I think is a really good interview question. One of my favorite interview questions for people in the counseling field is, tell me about a time you had a client that you experienced countertransference with and how you work through that. And that can be really impactful to think about, like, which clients really resonate with us, or we find it difficult to not allow them to push the boundaries on time, or various things of counseling. So that can be fun. And then resistance would be another area that's commonly, that they're trying to be aware of when the client is being really resistant. So an example of that would be if they're late for an appointment or late for several appointments. Then the therapist would need to bring that up and confront the client about them being late and maybe what that's saying about them not wanting to seek progress. So that's a really brief overview. There's a ton more information and certainly more about Carl Jung, but I just wanted to give you the briefest overview about psychoanalytic theory and some of the important things. So if you were just memorizing a few things for your comprehensive exams, I would suggest looking at those ego states and Erik Erikson stages and the sexual stages as well. So the next time we will be talking about another theory. I can't remember which right now, but that's it for today.